Welcome to the Awaken Podcast. My name is Natasja Pelgrom, and we are here at Breaking Convention 2025, interviewing many featured invited speakers. And today, I'm very delighted to finally, actually in person, meet Dr. Simon Ruffell. So good to see you finally.
Yeah, good to finally meet in person.
Yeah, we've had many different connections, and now we're here. But that's also the great thing about Breaking Convention. You know, it's like you have amazing content, but it is also just an ability to meet peers in the space from many walks of life and interests. So very grateful for that. But I want to introduce you properly. So I did not mesmerize all of the bios of every speaker.
Good.
So I'm going to read that, okay?
Please, please.
So if I make a mistake, then please correct. Dr. Simon Ruffell, medical doctor, psychiatrist, researcher, and student of the Shipibo shamanism, integrates Western medicine, psychology, and traditional plant healing. As the founder of Onaya and the chief medical officer of Four Minds, he investigates the potential of psychedelics to support mental health, innovation, and personal growth. With a PhD in Amazonian ayahuasca, Simon bridges traditional ayahuasca practices and Western science, collaborating with universities and indigenous healers to develop integrative approaches to healing, mental well-being, and expanded states of consciousness.
Nailed it.
Yeah. Nailed it. Thank you, ChatGPT, to make a smaller version.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I want to immediately start off with is something that I really value, and I was saying that to Kate, that is behind camera, was supporting this work here as well. I was saying that last night, something that I realized that I really appreciate about you is when I started to walk in this space from the underground more than a decade ago, it was so rare for people to acknowledge the Curanderismo, Vegetalismo, Tabaqueros. There's many different words to explain a specific practice in the lineage of the bigger word shamanism. For those of you that don't know, shamanism is a word from Siberia, and we're giving it actually to all of the different herbalistic practices. But the way that that was so lack of acknowledging, let alone someone with a degree in psychology, someone with a degree with neuroscience, someone with psychiatry, with someone with, as a doctor, then also going on a path of Curanderismo. And to me, this is what you're doing. You're literally walking the walk of bridging many ways of knowing. And that's been my motto. So
great.
Bridge the many ways of knowing. It's not about one way over the other, but how can we come together with it? And you're actually being an apprentice and a student in a practice. And maybe that can also create a pressure point or a tension point. So I will lead into my question for you is, where have you seen, maybe for yourself or as a professional, where the tension arises between the two?
Yeah, a really good question. I think a lot of the tension arises in the fact that Western science has to take a massive slice of humble pie and has to admit that it doesn't know a lot of what's going on within Curanderismo, within shamanism. So, I mean, one thing that's been particularly interesting for me is learning about how the Curanderos, how the Shipibo describe healing. So, for example, in the Shipibo tradition, healing takes place on three different levels, on three different dimensions. So, and firstly, before we even get into that, the Shipibo don't really talk about healing that much. In fact, it's quite rare to hear, at least in my experience, Shipibo talking about healing. They're mainly talking about bringing everything back into a state of harmony, bringing everything back into a state of balance. And so they describe this happening on three different levels. So you initially have the spiritual level. And if you become out of balance on the spiritual level, for most Westerners, you might not notice, maybe feel a little bit off. If you're training in some kind of shamanism or spiritual practice, you might recognize it if you're very sensitive. And if you don't address that, then it begins to manifest on the psychological level. You begin to get emotional problems, depression, anxiety, things like that. And if you don't address that, then it begins to manifest physically. You get these physical illnesses and diseases. And that's where Western medicine is mainly focused. So a lot of the tension comes from recognizing that there are huge blind spots that Western medicine has. And Western medicine needs to not only acknowledge that it does have these blind spots, but also there are areas that it really doesn't understand. For example, the spiritual realms, and listen to indigenous peoples and take indigenous knowledge seriously as well. So that's a huge sticking point. It's not placing Western medicine in a dominant position with the ability to either validate or not validate indigenous knowledge.
Yeah. And from your own, maybe it's a very personal question. So if you don't want to go there, it's totally fine. Say,
sure,
not going there. But maybe from your own education and then going into apprenticeship with Curanderismo and what you know, have you encountered your own resistances or your own biases that you had to work through? And if you want to answer this, could you give us an example of what that would be? Because I think it was such an important learning in that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, for me, it wasn't. I ended up in the Amazon rainforest for the first time in 2015, and I started doing research into ayahuasca in 2016. And I was open to what the Shipibo was saying, but like I didn't believe it. I was just like, okay, like most Westerners, like especially most kind of scientists, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, they're talking about like spirits, they're talking about these entities and energies, but actually, this is some kind of metaphor. This is theological. They don't really mean that there's actually, like a spirit or an entity that's interacting with us. And then over the years of going back and forward, I was trying desperately to squeeze what I was experiencing into this Western framework. And so, I'd be in ceremony and I'd be experiencing all of these faces, these beings. And Don Rono, who I apprenticed with, or I started apprenticing with a few years after this, would be saying, oh, this is great, Simon, this is great, because you're seeing all of these entities, you're seeing all these spirits, that's what they are. And I'd say, well, actually, Maestro Rono, I think you'll find that the brain is a predictive mechanism and it's expert at predicting faces because we're human. And so that's why I keep seeing, all of these faces within ceremonies. And he would just look at me and be like, oh, Simon. And it just continued like that for years until eventually I had an experience of actually witchcraft, which is quite common in the Amazon rainforest. And when that happened to me, there was no way that I could describe what was happening. There was no way that I could explain it in a Western framework. It had been harder and harder for me to fit it into a Western framework over the years. But with that experience, just overnight, boom, I was like, okay, this is quote unquote real. This is real in a way that we need to take it seriously. This is real in a way that I can't explain this through Western science. And then very quickly and abruptly after that, I started training in Shipibo-Konibo. This was 2019. So for me, it was quite an abrupt shift and a wake-up call of coming from a scientific background and thinking, okay, we have the answers and we're all talking about the same thing, to suddenly changing to think, oh my God, Western science doesn't have a clue, literally doesn't have a clue about this stuff that's happening in the Amazon rainforest. And these guys do, and we need to be working alongside them, taking what they say seriously.
Yeah, amazing. One of my personal experiences is I work with 5-MeO-DMT, as you know, and probably the audience that's watching, if you know me. But I've had the majority of clients have shifted over the years, and a very big shifted towards practitioners and facilitators that have been working with maestros and have experienced types of witchcraft, have experienced loss of power in that, and hijacked their energetic bodies, their mind, and going into spaces of quite despair, a lot of things happening, and I couldn't explain it. And somehow what happened is that people would come on my path and say, this is what's happening. At the time, I was working with one of my really good friends. She's trained in the Shipibo as well for
great.
25 to 30 years ago. So she wasn't able to work with them because this is for another time, a different topic, goes a little bit deeper into it. But it's almost like if the dialect and the dialect meet each other, then it can be traced back to her. So, but what I found was that 5-MeO, because I'm not trained in that dialect, I could surpass it with 5-MeO because it could reset the witchcraft or the hook or the bonding that was taking place or the things that were happening with individuals. So through trial and error, we found I had a translator to look through the vision of the tradition, but then come in with 5-MeO and untangle the witchery into that. And I'm sharing this with you because you just named it. I would normally not share this, but I find it very fascinating, the lack of actual people really acknowledging it.
Yeah.
It is true. It happens. It is a field where we're really childlike in infancy, embryonic state, maybe even. So long story to actually go towards, I'm curious, how are you translating this in the work that you're doing with science, these perspectives? Can you, I know it's not that far yet, but are you already thinking ahead of how would this be in a protocol? How could you make sense of this when you create a program or when you do have research and you hear encounters where you understanding, oh, that's that, but how do you then put that into the process, right? So curious if anything comes up with what I just shared.
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And so, Omnia as an organization is devoted to doing that, to bridging that gap. And we find it really hard. And that's what we do full time. And so, God knows how difficult it is for other organizations that are not entirely focused on this, but want to get into this work, working with Indigenous peoples. I can give you a few examples of some of the ways that we try to bridge those gaps and what we have coming up in the future. So as part of the work that we do for Anaya, we have something called the Indigenous Advisory Board. We sit down regularly with Don Rono and his brothers and sisters, their family and other people within that lineage. We say, what would you like to investigate? Like what should we look at together now? And this is always the exciting bit of the work because I never know what he's going to say or what any of them are going to say. And then when they do, I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to possibly research this and do it in a scientific framework? And one of the last times I spoke to him, he said he wanted to look at the impact of different icaros, the medicinal chanting songs of the Shipibo, on participants. So for example, the impact that a healing icaro has versus a protection icaro. I was thinking, how on earth are we going to do this? And so I sat down with the Onaya team and we came up with this idea called EEG hyperscan. So, I mean, EEG hyperscanning has been around before. We didn't come up with that idea, but we came up with using that for this purpose. And so what that involves is putting EEG caps on multiple participants at the same time. So we had a retreat with many participants. We had 5 people strapped up to EEGs at the same time in the ayahuasca ceremony. And then we recorded Don Rono singing his icaros. And then we translated his icaros into English. And so we could see when he was singing about protection versus when he was singing about healing. And then we put timestamps on the icaros and timestamps on the EEGs so that we could see when he was singing about protection, if it changed people's brainwaves in comparison to when he was singing about healing. And I was like, wow, we've done it. We've cracked it. I can't believe we've actually cracked it. And then I was speaking to Rono afterwards and was saying, so what did you think? What did you think about all the EEG caps? And, now we can see the impact that your icaros are having on participants. And he said, well, Simon, I have caps on each of you in the spirit world. It's just that you can't see them. And my caps are far superior to yours. And I was like, I can't argue with that. Like, I really can't argue with what you're saying. And it really brought home this truth, which is, despite our best efforts, was Rono meaning he wanted to look at the impact of icaros on brainwaves? Probably not. Like, does it make any difference? Icaros affecting brainwaves? Almost definitely, he's referring to something spiritual that Western science can't measure yet. And we need to be able to accept that as Western scientists. So one of the new projects that we're starting on, actually in collaboration with the Center for Minds, I've been speaking with Bruce.
Yes, Bruce.
Damer.
Yeah, was just here.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And we have a new project called the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Initiative, which is this project where it's actually in response to Benki. Benki is an indigenous elder from the Ashaninka tribe, and he got up in Denver at Psychedelic Science 2023 and basically said, it's great that you guys, like the Western world, have an interest in psychedelics, you have an interest in our medicine, but don't do it without us. And when I say don't do it without us, it's not because we need your support, it's because you need our support. You don't know what you're doing. You're new to this. We are the experts. Don't do it without us. We can support you. And so ICSI is a response to that, the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Initiative, where we are a group of scientists who are wanting and willing to engage with Indigenous communities, like at large, to try and think of a new way of approaching science, a way that is a mix of Indigenous science and Western science. And that means leaving Western concepts out. So even when we think about consciousness, that's a Western concept. And so we have to strip it one step back and take it all back to the beginning. And we're really talking about, reframing science and rewriting science. And one of the things on my mind is, how ready is science for this? Because at the moment we have loads of scientists saying, yes, Indigenous knowledge, it's so important. And then we end up with, one Indigenous panel in a massive conference where we all listen and we say like, yes, very important. And then no one does anything. But actually what it requires is taking these concepts seriously, not assuming they're metaphor theology, but really engaging with them, really engaging with spirits, really engaging with witchcraft, knowing that this stuff is real, and then adapting how we conduct science according to that.
Yeah. Beautiful. What is your latest findings with, maybe you can share a little bit about Onaya and what you're doing, and because maybe some in the audience might not know what Onaya is and what you stand for and what your group and your division is around it.
Yeah, so most recently with Onaya, so Onaya is a Shipibo word that means doctor, kind of loosely. It actually means the one who knows. It's not really a direct translation. And we're a group of scientists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, many other people working in collaboration with Indigenous curanderos, with Tibetan nuns, with Ayurvedic practitioners to try and bridge those gaps between Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And most recently, and we conduct research in the Amazon rainforest with ayahuasca. And most recently, we've been working with groups of military veterans suffering from PTSD in collaboration with a charity called Heroic Hearts. And so we brought these military veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD to the jungle, and then they drink ayahuasca in a traditional setting, and they receive healing from our Shipibo-Konibo. And what we found so far is that 84% of our participants no longer meet our criteria for PTSD immediately after the retreats, and then that's maintained at 6-month follow-up. And that's amazing. That's like literally amazing. I've never heard of any treatment being that successful, especially not for PTSD. It's incredible. I do need to caveat it with saying that we haven't published the studies yet. So we're in the second year of a 5-year study. So it hasn't been peer reviewed. But either way, it's a really interesting preliminary finding. So that's one of the main things we're up to at the moment. We're also running education courses. So we've linked together, again, psychiatrists, psychologists, neuroscientists with these Indigenous curanderos, Tibetan nuns, Ayurvedic practitioners. And we now have an accredited course that trains people in preparation and integration. The reason that we wanted it to bridge this gap is so that these therapists, when they're training to do prep and integration work, they have an understanding, even a basic understanding of Indigenous cosmology. So that when people are coming back from these kind of retreats and they have clients who have had contact with what they perceive to be entities and spirits, all these things, they don't just assume that it's something, some kind of delusion or religious delusion, pathologize it, as so often happens in psychiatry.
Yeah. What do you feel that is really needed right now in the psychedelic ecosystem?
Real communication and real dialogue between different ways of knowing. So Indigenous science, Western science. It's a kind of a crass way of saying it, but that's kind of loosely what I mean. If we're going to progress in science, if we're going to progress with psychedelics, and arguably, like in humanity, we need this kind of dialogue. We have so much knowledge, we have so much wisdom around the world. If we just connect and we share that wisdom, that's when I think we're going to make leaps and bounds forward. It's not about doing it individualistically. It's about doing it as a global community, because God knows we need to do that now before it's too late.
Yeah, yeah. And what do you see in the next 5 years that could be a way to develop towards with what you're doing? Maybe it's a hope.
Yeah. I mean, I would hope that projects like the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Initiative, like ICSI, really kick off. And I would hope that Indigenous practitioners from around the world want to be a part of that. They want to be a part of that dialogue. And I would hope that Western scientists also want to be a part of that dialogue as well. I think it's going to take a lot of time. I think it's going to take a lot of patience and energy. And I would hope that we could set up some kind of a panel where these discussions could happen, some kind of a protocol about how you go about doing this properly. So it's not extractive, it's appreciation rather than appropriation. And maybe if we do that, we might stand a good chance of sorting out this mess that we're in with humanity.
Yeah. If we look at the cosmology that you've been a part of and studying as well, and the mystical aspect, and let's go into one of the most seen is the serpent. Ronin the serpent.
Yeah.
And what do you believe is in that cosmology something that is really valuable to bridge into the work that you're doing? And does it explain anything about consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, so Ronin, the creation myth of Ronin the serpent in Shipibo is super interesting. So it's this giant, massive anaconda, which the Shipibo believe created the whole universe. And they say that each of the coils of the snake, each of the coils of Ronin represents different cycles of time and cycles of energy. And the Shipibo describe that as the cycles that we go through as humans in our lives. So we go through these cycles of birth, and then falling in love, and then illness and death, all these different cycles that each of us will experience as we go through our lives. But it also represents the cycling of energy. So I was really interested to speak to the Shipibo about this and ask them directly, reincarnation, does it happen? What do you think? And I was quite surprised when the curanderos were like, no, it just doesn't happen. I was like, oh, what, really? That kind of, I was like, really? That means that kind of flies in the face of Tibetan Buddhism and all these other kind of Eastern kind of ways of knowing. And then they said, yes, but energy is recycled. And so energy is recycled from previous lives, from different people. Energy is cycled from ancestors. And so within us, we have the energy of other people that we resonate with, the energy of our ancestors. And so in that way, this energy is recycled. And then we work through that in our lifetimes. And actually, that's far closer to the Tibetan Buddhist way of explaining reincarnation than just like, Natasja, you used to be a queen like 100 years ago.
Everybody's always Joan of Arc.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's never like, oh, you were just like a lowly farmer.
Peasant, hungry with one shoe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's been said to me, actually. So it seems to be in keeping with these other ways of knowing. Ronin as well, I find it particularly interesting that it's not just unique to the Shipibo. All across the Amazon, there's this concept of the giant anaconda, but then in Western society too. So the symbol for medicine is the snake going around the stick. And then the Old Testament, then we have the snake as well. So the snake is really always representing knowledge, power, and to the Shipibo, creation and destruction too. So I could go on about Shipibo cosmology for hours.
Let's go.
Let's go. How long do you have?
Yeah. So do you feel that it's a framework that helps you? Now, let me just ask it differently. How does this framework of understanding consciousness help you in the work that you're doing, in your day-to-day behind your computer? Structures, zeros and ones.
Yeah. I mean, the cosmology, it helps me, definitely in the research, it massively helps me in my everyday life. I mean, we've spoken about balance, right? About the Shipibo talking about everything being about balance and being in harmony. And that can lead to healing is one thing, but also just kind of a pleasant life, just kind of a nice life. And there's another really interesting phenomenon that the Shipibo described called kuna. And kuna are these geometric shapes under the Shipibo. You've probably seen it in Shipibo artwork. And they usually weave it into ceramic, weave it into kind of tapestries, paint it on ceramics, paint it on themselves, on curanderos, and other people. But these kuna, they literally, according to the Shipibo, they represent the vibrational forces in the universe. They're the artistic, the sacred artistic form of representing cosmic energy. And so the Shipibo describe everyone having your own personal kuna. So it's the energetic blueprint, the spiritual blueprint that all of us have. And then there'll be not just kunas between, not just our own personal kunas, but then kunas between different people. So for example, you and I will have our own blueprint. We'll have our own kuna, this cosmic pattern that exists between the two of us. And if there's any blockage, if there's any disruption in that pattern, then we need to fix it. Otherwise, there's going to be an issue in our relationship. And again, for everyone who's in this room, we're going to have our own kuna that represents our dynamic, as a trio.
Yeah.
And so that kind of really changed my perception as well. So I will be thinking, not just, oh, what did I say to Natasja, but are we in balance? Are we in tune with each other? Is there something that we need to do to rectify any disruption or blockage that might exist within our kuna? So it's really kind of changed the way that I perceive the world, and definitely kind of my actions with the whole of humanity and with the natural world as well, let alone the science.
Yeah. What are your stance on or viewpoints on the extraction of this medicines?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be super, super careful with that. I think that there is a really fine line between cultural appreciation and a cultural appropriation. So the Shipibo curanderos, at least the ones that I work with, they love it if Western people come and they have a real interest in their medicine and they want to learn and they want to try and understand their medicines. The Shipibo, the language is endangered. The Shipibo were very concerned there weren't going to be people training as curanderos because it's not a well-paid job historically. It's really one of the first times now that you can survive on just being a curandero. So if you have this interest, if you have this respect and you're there as a genuine student, they absolutely love it. What they don't love is when people are extracting their knowledge and they're not including them in that conversation. And so, for example, there are clinical trials. They're using forms of ayahuasca. I don't think we can actually call it ayahuasca because ayahuasca is more than just the chemicals. It's more than just the brew.
Yeah.
It's working with the curandero, it's the icaros, it's being in the jungle, it's the maloca, it's all of these different things. But what they don't like is when these things are taken and they're put into a pill, for example, and they're used and they're sold for money. And not only do they not like it because it's completely unfair, but also it's dangerous. It's dangerous to open up these doors of perception and to not have people there who can actually deal with it.
Yeah.
When I was speaking to Rono about this, when I was talking to him about the so-called psychedelic renaissance, I'm talking to him about the research that's been done in the West. And he was saying, okay, so, who do you have in the room when you give people psychedelics? There's usually a psychiatrist and there's usually a psychologist. And he was like, okay, but who do you have to work with the energy? I mean, no one really. We don't really talk like that. And he was like, okay, well, what if someone needs an exorcism? What if there's a demon? Well, again, we don't really use those concepts, in the kind of the Western framework. And he was saying, well, that's incredibly dangerous to use these psychedelics without somebody to conduct the energy, with someone who knows what they're doing. It's really dangerous and it really scares him. So as long as people are respecting ayahuasca, they're working with indigenous traditions, there's this appreciation, fantastic. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Yes. Yes. There's a question that's coming up, but I need to I need to ask it in a moment, not live on camera.
Right. Okay. Cool.
This is when you record live. When you record live, all the things that are coming, I was like, oh wait, no, I can't hold. I need to hold that one back.
I'm so intrigued.
My audience is now intrigued too. I will ask a variation of this question.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. When the Shipibo talk about that, you get called to it by the spirits, and it's not something that just anybody can do. You have to have that resonance with the spirit world. And in traditions, in traditional communities, it'll be people who've shown to have promise within that world. They'll be invited to be a curandero. So yeah, thank you for saying that.
When you look at, for example, where we are right now, what could be a way to help navigate the complexity of understanding the energetics and bring that within the scientific framework or the academic framework, and still have maybe a variation of it? Because I am an advisor in different initiatives, and this is always the question where the researchers itself or the therapist itself have had these experiences and understand that we're talking about, but then say, what do I do? Do I sage them in this clinical setting? Just the basics. Even the basics. How can what can I do in the environment of the setting that can help us energetically in that way? I have someone always off-site that is a seer, that is not involved, that sees more than I do because I'm involved. So that's always something to look for. But what is your perspective on that? How, and make it a simplification, because it's so big to in one time change the worldview like that.
Yeah.
Right? So if there are people that really want to bridge this and understand and go like, I want to validate this and I want to bring this in my own therapeutic practice, what is a way to do that? Is that maybe also through the framework of metaphor to start with? This is what I do with a lot of clients, still work like that.
This is a great question. There's so many different angles to go with.
Yeah, this is why I needed to reformulate myself.
No, you did it. It's really important. I have a few thoughts. So firstly, so I used to be based in Australia, working on clinical trials looking at ayahuasca analogs. So it's botanical plants from Australia that have DMT and have MOAIs, just like ayahuasca, but they're indigenous to Australia, loosely called Ozihuasca. That's what it's referred to as. And when I was there, I had this exact thing where I was working in a hospital. I was like, okay, how can we begin to incorporate this spiritual hygiene as a very basic thing into these trials? And so I tried to put into the protocol that we would burn sage or Palo Santo, and the hospital were just like, no, you can't do that. You can't just like burn pieces of wood like in our hospital. And we ended up getting a Palo Santo aromatherapy and just diffusing it. I was like, does that work? I mean, like, I think maybe it's good enough for now. It's like the best that we can do. And so it's really tricky. I think that we're probably going to see different forms, different ways that psychedelics can be used outside of the mainstream medical model. So almost like acupuncture. So acupuncture isn't recommended by most mainstream medicine, but it still has a board of advisors, to make sure, a board of ethics to make sure that everything's done, that good practices is performed within the guild of acupuncture therapists. I think we'll probably see that with psychedelics. So we can begin to bring these practices into things outside the Western medical system, like independent clinics and things like that. So that's one thing. The other thing that you mentioned was, do we still need to use metaphor to get across the ideas of spirits and energies? How do we communicate that to scientists? And this is a fantastic question, because even for me, training in Shipibo, whenever anyone says like, oh, the energy, I immediately internally roll my eyes and think like, you daft fucking hippie. But then I have to, no, wait, hold on. That's like some old programming. I need to bring it back again.
Listen,
and focus. And I think the answer to that is metaphysics. Like, I think that the way that we can translate these things is through philosophy, is through metaphysical philosophy. Panpsychism. If we can talk about panpsychism, everything having a degree of consciousness and then there being one larger consciousness, most scientists can think, okay, that's a philosophical concept. I can understand that academically, and it makes more sense to me than this plant has a spirit that I can talk to. And so I think that we can use metaphysics as that bridge, as that go-between. And this is new territory.
I know.
This is super exciting. The scientists are beginning to be open to this, at least a few. And I'm hoping that it will be, a movement that spreads, that we can really learn from and really accelerates science, both from an Indigenous point of view and a Western.
Yeah. You're also speaking into someone we interviewed at the launch of season 4, Peter, Dr. Peter. So he's here as well. We'll put the link in the show notes. Speaks exactly about this and these frameworks, and he's also part of Awaken Convention.
Yeah.
We're coming almost to the close of today. Is there anything you would like to share that I haven't asked?
I want to know what your secret question is. I don't know if I can ask that on camera.
We'll do that off camera.
Yeah. Okay. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for being so open to all of this as always. And really good to meet you in person.
Yes, and I'm going to close with a few random questions.
Please.
And I've have a favorite one that I've been asking everybody, so that apparently that's the one I want to know most. Sure. Is what is the meal that reminds you of a home?
Meal that reminds me of home. What? I mean, I'm going to be super British here and just say Sunday lunch. Like, so.
That roast?
Yeah, like roast dinner. So like roast chicken and potatoes.
It's so good.
We used to do it every Sunday.
Yes, yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
If you would be a master teacher plant, which one would you be?
I mean, I have to go with the plant that I diet the most, which is Noirao, which is the sacred tree of the Shipibo.
Yes.
She is my number one teacher, my number one guide. The only reason I do any of this is because of her.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And if you and I would go into the kitchen and we would make something together, what would be a meal that represents our energy together here today?
I feel like I need to say something really good now. I can't say hot noodle or something like that. That's a good
What would be
question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there'd be some spice in there because you're kind of fiery. So I think I don't know. Yeah, maybe there'd be. I don't know. I feel like maybe like a kind of like a Moroccan meze or something.
That's a good one. We had a Moroccan meze the night that we arrived here.
Oh, really? That was awesome. Bang on.
That. Thank you so much, Simon, for being here. And what are you going to see, or what have you seen that inspired you at Awaken Convention?
What have I seen that inspired me at Awaken Convention? I'm trying to think about this. Peter's talk actually was super good. I mean, I'm really into bringing metaphysics into this conversation. I think it's the way forward. I've been speaking a lot to Peter about it. And so getting more people interested in these old philosophical concepts, which were illegal about 500 years ago. You get burned at the stake for talking about the consciousness of everything. So seeing these coming back into kind of the mainstream psychedelic conversation now, like that for me is the most exciting thing.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.